The sound of gunfire cracked across the dusty horizon as Harriet Green tried desperately to keep her horse steady. The 5 riders behind her were gaining ground with each passing second, and the Montana wilderness offered few places to hide. It was 1878, and the 30-mile journey from her family's homestead to Bozeman had turned into a race for her life. "Come on, Penny," Harriet urged her chestnut mare, feeling the animal's strength beginning to fade beneath her. The saddlebags filled with her father's medication bounced against the horse's flanks as they thundered across the open plain. A bullet whizzed past her ear, close enough that she felt the air disturb her honey-blonde hair. Harriet knew she couldn't outrun them much longer. The Blackwater Gang had been terrorizing this part of Montana territory for months, and now they were after her. Penny stumbled, nearly sending Harriet flying. The mare had stepped in a prairie dog hole, and though she recovered, Harriet knew the race was lost. Ahead was a small copse of trees surrounding a creek, her last hope for cover. She guided the exhausted horse toward the trees, but before she could reach them, another shot rang out. This time Penny let out a terrible scream as the bullet found its mark in her hind quarter. The horse went down hard, and Harriet barely managed to kick free of the stirrups before being crushed. She hit the ground with a painful thud, the air driven from her lungs. By the time she could breathe again, 5 horses surrounded her, their riders looking down with expressions ranging from amusement to cold calculation. "Well, well," said the man with a distinctive scar running from his eye to his jaw. "Looks like we caught ourselves a pretty little bird." Harriet tried to stand, but a boot pressed down on her shoulder, pinning her to the dirt. "Please," she managed, "I'm just trying to get medicine for my father." The scarred man, clearly the leader, dismounted and crouched beside her. "That's so. And what might a fine-looking woman like you have that's worth anything to us?" "Nothing," Harriet said, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Just let me go." The man laughed, a sound as dry and merciless as the Montana wind. "That's where you're wrong, miss. You're worth plenty. The Slater brothers over in Virginia City will pay good money for a woman like you." Terror seized Harriet's heart. Everyone knew what happened to women sold to the mining camps. "Tie her up," the leader ordered, "and grab those saddlebags. Might be something useful in them." Rough hands yanked Harriet to her feet, binding her wrists tightly with coarse rope. As they forced her onto the back of one of their horses, she caught sight of poor Penny, struggling to stand with blood streaming down her leg. "My horse," she pleaded. "At least put her out of her misery." The scarred man shrugged and drew his pistol, firing a single shot. Penny collapsed, and Harriet felt tears streaming down her face. "Let's move," the man ordered. "We need to make camp before nightfall." As they rode away, Harriet silently prayed that someone would notice she never made it to town. But with her father bedridden and her nearest neighbors miles away, she feared no one would even know she was missing until it was too late. Miles away on the outskirts of Bozeman, Gabriel Blackett leaned against the bar at the Silver Dollar Saloon, nursing a whiskey as he listened to the town gossip. At 32, Gabe was well known throughout Montana territory, a former cavalry scout turned bounty hunter who had a reputation for bringing in his targets alive when others brought them in dead. "You heard about the Blackwater Gang?" the barkeeper asked, wiping down the counter. "Word is they hit another homestead over near Helena last week." Gabe nodded, his green eyes thoughtful beneath the brim of his worn leather hat. "Marshal Wilson still offering that reward. $500 for each member, double for Scar Wallace himself," the barkeeper confirmed. "But they're ghost-like. Here one day, vanished the next." Gabe was about to reply when the saloon doors burst open. An older man stumbled in, breathing hard, his clothes covered in trail dust. "Someone help," he called out. Doc Green's daughter never made it to town. She left yesterday morning for supplies and medicine. Something's happened to her." The saloon fell silent. Everyone knew Doc Green. He'd saved enough lives in Bozeman that his name carried weight, even though his homestead was a good distance outside town. Where was she coming from? Gabe asked, setting down his glass. "The Green place, about 30 miles east," the man replied. "Been taking care of her father since he took ill with the fever." Gabe exchanged a glance with the barkeeper. That was right in the territory where the Blackwater Gang had been operating. "I'll go look for her," Gabe said, draining his whiskey. "That country's dangerous right now." The old man looked relieved. "Marshal Wilson's organizing a search party, but they won't leave until morning. Morning might be too late," Gabe replied grimly. He settled his hat more firmly on his head and headed for the door. "What's her name?" "Harriet," the man called after him. "Harriet Green. Blonde hair, blue eyes, 26 years old, riding a chestnut mare." Gabe nodded and stepped out into the dusty street. Within 20 minutes, he had his supplies packed, his Winchester rifle secured to his saddle, and was heading east out of Bozeman. The sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon, but Gabe knew these lands better than most. If the girl had run into trouble, every hour might count. As darkness descended, he pushed on, following the main trail toward the Green homestead. Few travelers would be on the road this late, especially with the Blackwater Gang terrorizing the territory. Gabe had been tracking them for months, studying their patterns, learning their habits. If they had taken the doctor's daughter, he might finally have a chance to bring them to justice. 3 hours into his ride, just as true darkness had fallen, Gabe spotted something on the trail ahead. Slowing his horse, he approached cautiously, his hand resting on his revolver. In the pale moonlight, he made out the form of a horse, lying still on the ground. Dismounting, Gabe approached the dead animal. A chestnut mare, with a bullet wound in its hind quarter and another in its head, a mercy killing. Examining the area around the horse, he found signs of a struggle and multiple hoof prints heading north. 5 riders, he muttered to himself, reading the tracks as clearly as words on a page. And 1 captive. The Blackwater Gang typically consisted of 5 men. This had to be them. And they had Harriet Green. Gabe returned to his horse, a powerful black stallion named Shadow, and mounted up. The tracks were fresh, less than a day old. If he rode through the night, he might catch up to them by morning. The gang wouldn't be expecting pursuit so quickly, which might give him an advantage. As he urged Shadow forward, following the tracks by moonlight, Gabe considered his options. The gang was dangerous, and he was just one man. But surprise was on his side, and he knew these men knew how they thought, how they operated. If they had taken Harriet Green, they would be headed for one of their hideouts, probably the old mining cabin near the Gallatin River. What he didn't know was whether Harriet would still be alive when he found her. The Blackwater Gang wasn't known for their gentle treatment of captives. Harriet's wrists were raw from the rope binding them. She sat huddled against a tree, watching as the 5 men set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by pines. They had ridden for hours, taking a twisting path through hills and valleys that left her hopelessly disoriented. Now, with night fallen, they had stopped to rest. The leader, whom the others called Scar, had taken her father's medicine and examined it before tossing it aside with a sneer. "Worthless," he declared, and Harriet had felt her heart sink. Even if she somehow escaped, she couldn't return home without the medicine. "What about her?" one of the men asked, nodding toward Harriet. He was younger than the others, with a wispy attempt at a beard that made him look barely past 18. "The Slater brothers will pay well," Scar replied, adding more wood to their small fire. "Pretty, educated women are rare in the mining camps." Couldn't we just ransom her? The young one suggested. Her folks might pay, Scar laughed. Her pa's a country doctor with the fever. You think he's got cash? Use your head, Joey. Joey fell silent, but he kept glancing at Harriet with what seemed like discomfort. The other men ignored her, drinking from canteens that Harriet suspected contained something stronger than water. I need water, she said, her voice raspy from hours without a drink. Scar looked at her for a long moment before nodding to Joey. Give her some water. Can't deliver damaged goods. The young outlaw approached with a canteen, holding it to Harriet's lips. She drank gratefully, noting the flicker of shame in the boy's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded slightly before retreating to join the others. As the night deepened, the men took turns standing watch while the others slept. Harriet remained awake, her mind racing with desperate plans for escape. But with her hands tied and 5 armed men surrounding her, the chances seemed impossibly slim. She thought of her father, weak with fever in their small homestead. Without the medicine, would he survive until she found a way to return? And what about her? The thought of being sold to the Slater brothers' mining camp made her stomach twist with dread. Just before dawn, when the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, Harriet heard it the soft nicker of a horse, not from their camp. Her heart leaped. Someone was out there. The man on watch, a burly outlaw with a thick mustache, seemed to hear it too. He stood, peering into the pre-dawn darkness with his hand on his gun. "Who's there?" he called, his voice carrying through the still morning air. No answer came, but the forest around them had gone oddly silent. "Wake up," the guard hissed to his companions. "Someone's out there." The camp stirred to life, men reaching for weapons as they rose from their bedrolls. Scar emerged from beneath his blanket, already gripping his revolver. "Spread out," he ordered quietly. "Might just be a traveler." The men began to move in different directions, weapons drawn. Joey was left to guard Harriet, looking nervously into the surrounding trees. A twig snapped somewhere to their right. Joey's head whipped around, his gun pointing toward the sound. Harriet held her breath. The shot, when it came, was from the opposite direction. One of the outlaws cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions, as though they were surrounded by a small army rather than what sounded like a single rifle firing with incredible precision and speed. Another outlaw went down, this time with a bullet in his leg. "It's a trap," Scar shouted. "Fall back to the horses." Joey looked panicked, unsure whether to stay with Harriet or join his companions. Making a quick decision, he cut her bonds with a knife. "Run," he whispered urgently. "Get out of here." Before Harriet could respond, a bullet struck the tree above them, showering them with bark. Joey yelped and dove for cover, leaving Harriet free but exposed. She didn't hesitate. Scrambling to her feet, Harriet dashed toward the densest part of the forest, away from both the gunfire and the outlaws' horses. Behind her, she could hear shouting and more gunshots. Harriet ran blindly through the trees, branches whipping at her face, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea who was attacking the camp lawmen, perhaps, or a rival gang. Either way, it was her chance to escape. She had covered perhaps 100 yards when a strong arm suddenly wrapped around her waist, pulling her behind a large tree. A hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream. "Quiet," a deep voice commanded in her ear. "I'm here to help you." Harriet froze, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "I'm going to take my hand away," the voice continued, low and steady. "Don't scream. The Blackwater Gang is still out there, not if you understand." Harriet nodded slowly, and the hand lifted from her mouth. She turned to see a tall man with intense green eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. He wore the practical clothing of a frontiersman, a leather vest over a faded blue shirt, sturdy trousers and boots that had seen many miles. "Who are you?" she whispered. "Gabriel Blackett," he replied, checking the chamber of his revolver before holstering it. "People call me Gabe. I'm from Bozeman. Someone raised the alarm when you didn't make it to town." Relief washed over Harriet like a wave. "My father, he needs medicine." "I was bringing it from town when they attacked me," Gabe nodded. "I know. But right now we need to get you safely away from here. The shots will have scared off 3 of them, but Scar and at least 1 other are still out there." "How do you know their names?" Harriet asked, suddenly suspicious. "I've been tracking the Blackwater Gang for months," he explained, his eyes continuously scanning their surroundings. "They've got a price on their heads." "You're a bounty hunter," Gabe's mouth tightened slightly. "Among other things. My horse is hidden about a quarter-mile east." "Think you can make it?" Harriet nodded, determined. "Yes. Lead the way." They moved through the forest as quietly as possible, Gabe occasionally stopping to listen or check for signs of pursuit. Harriet followed close behind, still hardly believing that rescue had come. "There he is," Gabe whispered as they approached a small, sheltered hollow where a magnificent black stallion stood waiting, reins loosely tied to a low branch. The horse nickered softly as they approached. Gabe quickly untied him, then turned to help Harriet mount. "We'll ride double," he said, lifting her onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. "Hold on tight. We need to put some distance between us," and a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the tree beside them. Gabe cursed, wheeling the horse around as he drew his revolver. Scar Wallace stood 20 yards away, his scarred face twisted with rage, his gun aimed directly at them. "You cost me 2 men, Blackett," he snarled. "And my payday." "Your men will live," Gabe replied evenly, his body tense behind Harriet. "And the lady was never yours to sell." Scar's laugh was ugly. "Always the hero. That's why you'll die a poor man." "Maybe," Gabe said, "but I'll die with a clear conscience." Scar's finger tightened on the trigger, but Gabe was faster. His revolver barked once and Scar staggered backward, his shot going wild. The outlaw looked down in shock at the blood spreading across his shoulder. Before he could recover, Gabe spurred the stallion forward, thundering past the wounded man and deeper into the forest. Harriet clung to the saddle horn as the powerful horse carried them away, branches whipping past on either side. "Will he follow?" she called over the sound of hoofbeats. "Not with that shoulder," Gabe replied grimly. "But the others might. We need to keep moving." They rode hard for nearly an hour, following game trails and stream beds to mask their tracks. Eventually, they emerged from the forest onto a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of Montana wilderness. In the distance, the snow-capped peaks of the mountains caught the morning sun. Gabe finally slowed the horse to a walk, allowing the animal to recover its breath. Harriet became acutely aware of the man behind her, the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back, the strength in the arm that held the reins around her. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving my life." "You're not safe yet," Gabe replied, though his voice had softened. "The rest of the gang is still out there. We need to get you back to Bozeman." "But my father's medicine," Harriet protested. "Without it, he'll—" Gabe was silent for a moment. "What medicine does he need?" "Quinine for the fever, and a tincture Dr. Reynolds prepared specially for his heart." "I know Reynolds," Gabe said thoughtfully. "If we make it to my cabin by nightfall, I could ride into Bozeman at first light, get the medicine, and have it to your father by tomorrow afternoon." Hope sparked in Harriet's chest. "Your cabin, is it close?" Gabe nodded. "About 4 hours' ride from here. It's secluded, the gang won't find us there. It will be safer than trying to make it all the way to Bozeman today." Harriet considered this. The idea of spending the night in a remote cabin with a man she just met would normally be unthinkable. But these weren't normal circumstances, and something about Gabriel Blackett made her feel safe despite the danger they were in. "All right," she agreed. "Lead on, Mr. Blackett." "Gabe," he corrected gently. "Just Gabe." As they continued their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky, Harriet found herself studying the man who had risked his life to rescue her. There was a quiet confidence about him, a steadiness that came from years of self-reliance in this harsh territory. Yet there was kindness too, evident in the way he'd carefully bound the rope burns on her wrists with strips of cloth from his own shirt when they'd stopped to rest. "How did you find me?" she asked as they crossed a shallow stream, the water splashing around the horse's legs. "Tracked you," Gabe replied matter-of-factly. "Found your horse first. After that, the gang didn't exactly cover their trail well. You must be very good at tracking." He shrugged slightly. "Learned from the Crow when I was scouting for the cavalry. Lived with them for almost 2 years." Harriet was impressed. Few white men were accepted into Native American tribes. "Is that how you learned to shoot like that? Back at the camp, it sounded like an entire posse." A small smile touched Gabe's lips. "Old cavalry trick. Fire, move, fire again from a different position. Makes the enemy think they're outnumbered." "It worked," Harriet said with admiration. "You took on 5 armed outlaws by yourself." "Not something I'd normally recommend," Gabe replied dryly. "But I didn't have much choice. Couldn't let them get away with you." There was something in his voice when he said this, a personal note that made Harriet wonder if there was more to his pursuit of the Blackwater Gang than just bounties. By mid-afternoon, they were approaching a heavily wooded area at the base of a rocky slope. Gabe guided the horse through what seemed like impenetrable forest until suddenly, a small clearing appeared. In the center stood a well-built log cabin with a stone chimney, nestled so perfectly into the landscape that one could ride within 50 yards and never know it was there. "Home," Gabe said simply, dismounting before helping Harriet down. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. Gabe's hand steadied her, strong and sure on her waist. For a moment, they stood close enough that Harriet could see flecks of gold in his green eyes. Then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "I'll see to the horse," he said, leading the stallion toward a small lean-to stable at the side of the cabin. "Make yourself at home." The cabin was simple but surprisingly comfortable inside. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a solid wooden table and chairs before it. Shelves lined another wall, holding books, supplies, and what looked like hand-carved wooden figures. A curtained alcove presumably concealed the bed. Harriet was examining one of the wooden carvings, a remarkably detailed hawk in flight, when Gabe returned. "You made these?" she asked, holding up the carving. He nodded, looking almost embarrassed. "Passes the time during winter storms." "They're beautiful," Harriet said sincerely, replacing the hawk on the shelf. "You have a gift." Gabe busied himself starting a fire in the hearth, seemingly uncomfortable with the praise. "Are you hungry? I have some venison jerky and beans." "Starving," Harriet admitted. "They didn't feed me." Anger flashed briefly across Gabe's face before he controlled it. "I'll fix us something." As he prepared a simple meal, heating beans in a pot over the fire and slicing bread from a loaf stored in a wooden box, Harriet washed her face and hands in a basin of water he'd provided. The cool water felt wonderful against her skin, washing away some of the fear and exhaustion of the past 24 hours. They ate at the wooden table, the food simple but satisfying after her ordeal. As they finished, Harriet found herself studying Gabe again. There was a scar on his left forearm, visible where he'd rolled up his sleeves, and another smaller one at his temple, just below his hairline. "How long have you been a bounty hunter?" she asked. Gabe set down his cup of coffee. "About 5 years." Before that, I was a cavalry scout, then a guide for settlers coming west. And before that, a shadow crossed his face. Before that, I was a boy in Pennsylvania with a father who taught me to shoot straight and a mother who taught me to carve wood. There was clearly more to the story, but Harriet didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they'd left behind. "What about you?" Gabe asked, turning the conversation away from himself. "Always been in Montana territory." Harriet shook her head. "Father and I came from Boston 6 years ago after my mother died. He was a respected physician there, but the memories were too painful. He wanted a fresh start." "And you? Did you want a fresh start too?" The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. I wanted my father to be happy again, and I'd lost someone too." Gabe nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your husband, fiancé," Harriet corrected softly. "Thomas. Typhoid took him 3 weeks before our wedding." "I'm sorry," Gabe said, and she could tell he meant it. "It was a long time ago," Harriet replied, though the ache never truly disappeared. "Father's practice is my life now. He's been teaching me medicine, not formally, of course, but I assist with everything. When he became ill 2 months ago, I took over caring for our neighbors." Gabe looked impressed. "A woman doctor, that's rare." "Not a doctor," Harriet clarified. "Just helping where I can." "From what I hear around Bozeman, you do more than just help. The Andersons say you saved their youngest from pneumonia last winter." Harriet's eyes widened in surprise. "You know the Andersons?" Gabe nodded. "Montana's a big place with a small population. People talk, especially about someone who does good work." A blush warmed Harriet's cheeks at the unexpected compliment. Outside, the light was beginning to fade as evening approached. Gabe rose to add more wood to the fire, then checked the windows and door, ensuring they were secure. "I'll sleep by the fire," he said, nodding toward the curtained alcove. "You can take the bed. We'll leave at first light. I'll go to Bozeman for the medicine while you stay here. It's safer." Harriet wanted to protest, to insist on accompanying him to town, but she knew he was right. The Blackwater Gang would be looking for her, and traveling together would make them more conspicuous. "Thank you," she said instead, "for everything." Gabe simply nodded, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. That night, lying in Gabe's surprisingly comfortable bed, Harriet listened to the sounds of the wilderness outside, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the soft rustle of wind through pines. Inside, she could hear Gabe's steady breathing from where he lay near the fire. For the first time since her capture, she felt truly safe. As sleep claimed her, Harriet realized that despite the danger and fear of the past day, she felt more alive than she had in years. Morning came with pale light filtering through the cabin's single window. Harriet woke to find Gabe already up, brewing coffee and preparing a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with honey. "You should reach Bozeman by noon if you ride hard," she said as they ate. "Dr. Reynolds' office is on. I know where it is," Gabe interrupted gently. "And your father's homestead too. I'll get the medicine to him by mid-afternoon at the latest." Harriet bit her lip. "I wish I could come with you." "Too dangerous," Gabe said firmly. "The gang will be watching the trails to town. One rider attracts less attention than two, especially when one is a woman they're hunting." "And what if they find me here while you're gone?" Harriet challenged. Gabe reached into a trunk near the fireplace and pulled out a shotgun. "You know how to use this?" Harriet nodded. "Every woman on the frontier learned to handle firearms out of necessity." "Good," Gabe said, placing the shotgun on the table between them. "But they won't find you. No one knows about this place except a few Crow friends." After breakfast, Gabe prepared to leave, checking his weapons and saddling Shadow. Harriet stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching as he worked efficiently, his movements economical and precise. "Be careful," she said as he mounted up. "The Blackwater Gang won't have given up." Gabe's expression hardened. "I'm counting on that." Something in his tone made Harriet study him more carefully. "This is personal for you, isn't it, hunting them?" For a moment, Gabe said nothing, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the trees. Then he looked down at her, his eyes shadowed beneath his hat brim. "3 years ago, they took a woman hostage during a bank robbery in Helena," he said quietly. "My sister. They killed her when they no longer needed the leverage." Harriet's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Gabe." "I've been tracking them ever since," he continued, his voice flat. "They've slipped away every time, until now." "Is that why you came after me?" Harriet asked. "For revenge?" Gabe's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "I came after you because you needed help." "But yes, stopping the Blackwater Gang has been my purpose for a long time." Before Harriet could respond, he tipped his hat to her. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me. I'll be back before sundown." With that, he wheeled Shadow around and rode off into the trees, soon disappearing from view. Harriet stood watching the empty space where he had been, her mind churning with this new understanding of the man who had saved her life. The day passed slowly for Harriet, each hour stretching endlessly as she waited for Gabe's return. She kept the shotgun close, startling at every unexpected sound from the forest. To distract herself, she explored the cabin more thoroughly, learning more about its owner through his possessions. The books on his shelves revealed a well-educated mind, volumes of history and natural philosophy, alongside practical guides to tracking and survival. A small wooden box contained letters tied with faded ribbon, though Harriet respected his privacy too much to read them. In a drawer, she found sketches of wildlife and landscapes, rendered with the same skilled hand that had carved the wooden figures. Gabriel Blackett, she was discovering, was far more than the hard-edged bounty hunter he appeared to be. By late afternoon, anxiety began to gnaw at her. Gabe should have reached Bozeman hours ago. What if something had happened? What if the Blackwater Gang had caught him on the trail? As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Harriet's fears grew stronger. She paced the cabin, shotgun in hand, peering out the window for any sign of movement among the trees. Finally, just as dusk was settling over the forest, she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Harriet positioned herself beside the window, shotgun raised, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. Relief washed over her as Gabe came into view, riding alone through the trees. But as he drew closer, she could see he was slumped forward in the saddle, one hand pressed to his side. Harriet flung open the door and rushed to meet him as he guided Shadow into the clearing. Blood had soaked through his shirt on the left side, and his face was pale beneath his tan. "What happened?" she cried, helping him dismount. Gabe grimaced as his feet hit the ground. "Ran into Joey and another one of Wallace's men on the trail back. Got your father's medicine, though." He patted the saddlebag. "Never mind that now," Harriet said, supporting him as they moved toward the cabin. "You're bleeding badly." Inside, she helped him to a chair and quickly gathered water, clean cloths, and the medical kit she'd spotted earlier on a shelf. With practiced hands, she cut away his bloodied shirt to reveal a deep gash along his ribs. "Knife?" she asked, examining the wound. Gabe nodded, his jaw tight with pain. "Joey's friend. I wasn't expecting him to be so quick." "What happened to them?" Harriet asked as she began cleaning the wound. "Joey will live," Gabe replied grimly. "His friend won't." Harriet's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. This was the reality of the frontier: kill or be killed when faced with men like the Blackwater Gang. "The wound needs stitching," she said, reaching for a needle and thread from the medical kit. "It's going to hurt." Gabe managed a strained smile. Not my first time being sewn up. Drink this first, Harriet said, pouring a generous measure of whiskey from a bottle she found in a cupboard. Gabe downed it in one swallow, then gripped the edges of the chair as Harriet began to stitch the wound. His body tensed with each insertion of the needle, but he made no sound beyond his quickened breathing. As she worked, Harriet found herself intensely aware of him, the heat of his skin beneath her fingers, the solid muscle of his torso, the scent of leather and pine that clung to him. Despite the circumstances, she felt a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with concern for his injury. "You have steady hands," Gabe observed, watching her work. "Your father taught you well." "He believes women make better healers," Harriet replied, focusing on her stitches. "Says we have more patience and gentler touch." "He's not wrong," Gabe said softly. Harriet glanced up, finding his green eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. She quickly returned her attention to the wound. "What about my father's medicine?" she asked, changing the subject. "You said you got it." Gabe nodded toward the saddlebag he dropped by the door. "Dr. Reynolds prepared everything. Said to tell you he's added something for the cough that's developed." Worry surged through Harriet. "A cough? That's new." "Reynolds didn't seem overly concerned," Gabe reassured her. "But we should get the medicine to him tomorrow." "We need to go tonight," Harriet insisted, tying off the last stitch. "If he's developed a cough with the fever, Harriet," Gabe interrupted gently, "it's nearly dark. The trails aren't safe at night, especially with the gang still out there. And I'm in no condition to protect you properly right now." She knew he was right, but the thought of her father suffering through another night without medicine twisted her heart. "First light," Gabe promised, seeing her distress. "We'll leave at first light and push hard. Your father will have his medicine before noon." Harriet nodded reluctantly, applying a clean bandage to Gabe's wound. "There, try not to move too much or you'll tear the stitches." "Yes, madam," Gabe replied with the ghost of a smile. He caught her hand as she withdrew it from the bandage. "Thank you." The touch of his calloused fingers against her skin sent a surprising warmth up her arm. For a moment, they remained like that, connected by the simple contact of hand against hand, eyes locked in an unspoken exchange. Then Harriet gently pulled away, suddenly conscious of their situation alone in the cabin. Gabe half-dressed, the intimacy of having tended his wound. "You should rest," she said, busying herself with cleaning up the medical supplies. "I'll make some food." As she moved around the small cabin, preparing a simple meal from Gabe's supplies, Harriet found herself glancing repeatedly at the man seated by the fire. Despite his injury, there was nothing vulnerable about Gabriel Blackett. Even wounded, he exuded a quiet strength that filled the cabin with his presence. They ate in companionable silence, both tired from the day's events. Outside, night had fully descended, wrapping the cabin in darkness broken only by the occasional call of a night bird. "Take the bed again," Gabe said as they finished eating. "I'll manage fine here." "You're injured," Harriet protested. "You should take the bed. I can sleep by the fire." Gabe shook his head firmly. "Not happening." Harriet recognized the stubborn set of his jaw and knew arguing would be pointless. "At least let me check your bandage again before I turn in." He submitted to her examination with surprisingly good grace, sitting patiently as she inspected her handiwork. The wound showed no signs of fresh bleeding, and his skin wasn't overly hot to the touch, a good sign that infection hadn't set in. "You'll live," she pronounced, drawing a smile from him. "Good to know, Doc," he replied, his voice warm with something that might have been admiration. That night, Harriet again lay in Gabe's bed, listening to the sounds of the wilderness and the man sleeping near the fire. Despite her worry for her father, she felt a strange contentment. In Gabriel Blackett, She had found something she hadn't expected: a kindred spirit, someone who understood loss and duty and the harsh realities of frontier life. Morning brought clear skies and the promise of fair weather for their journey. Harriet woke early, finding Gabe already up and moving about the cabin with only a slight stiffness to betray his injury. "How do you feel?" she asked, joining him by the fire where coffee was brewing. "I'll do," he replied, handing her a cup. "We can leave within the hour." They prepared quickly, Gabe packing only essential supplies and checking his weapons while Harriet secured her father's medicine in an inside pocket of her borrowed jacket. Shadow seemed rested and eager as Gabe saddled him, tossing his head and pawing at the ground. "We'll need to ride double again," Gabe said, helping Harriet mount before swinging up behind her. "It'll slow us down some, but it's safer than trying to find you another horse." As they rode away from the cabin, Harriet was struck by a peculiar sense of leaving home, despite having spent only a single night there. Something about Gabe's simple dwelling, with its books and carvings and the lingering scent of wood smoke, had felt unexpectedly comfortable. They took a different route than the one Gabe had used the previous day, keeping to less traveled paths through the wilderness. Harriet could feel the tension in his body behind her, his senses alert for any sign of danger. "Will they come after you?" she asked as they paused to rest the horse at a small stream. "The remaining gang members," Gabe shrugged, wincing slightly at the pull on his stitches. "Maybe. Scar Wallace isn't the type to forget a defeat, but they're wounded and scattered now. It'll take time for them to regroup. And then—" his expression hardened. "Then I'll finish what I started." The determined edge to his voice reminded Harriet of his quest for justice or vengeance for his sister. She laid a hand on his arm, feeling the muscle tense beneath her touch. "Gabe," she said softly. "What happened to your sister wasn't your fault." His jaw tightened. "I should have been there. I was supposed to meet her in Helena that day. You couldn't have known." "Doesn't matter," he said flatly. "She was all the family I had left. I owe her this." Before Harriet could respond, Gabe stiffened, his gaze fixed on something beyond the trees. "Get behind me," he said quietly, drawing his revolver. Harriet moved quickly, heart pounding as Gabe positioned himself between her and whatever threat he'd spotted. But instead of danger, a moment later a rider emerged from the trees. Marshal Wilson from Bozeman, accompanied by 2 deputies. "Blackett," the marshal called, recognizing him immediately. "We've been searching for Miss Green since yesterday." Relief washed over Harriet as the lawman approached. "Marshal Wilson," she greeted him. "I'm fine, thanks to Mr. Blackett." The marshal's weathered face registered surprise as he took in the situation. Harriet in men's clothing, riding double with the notorious bounty hunter. "The Blackwater Gang took her," Gabe explained before the marshal could comment. "I tracked them and got her out. We're headed to Doc Green's place now with medicine." Marshal Wilson nodded slowly. "We found 2 of them, one dead, one with a bullet in his shoulder. The wounded one sang like a bird, told us everything about their operation." "And Scar Wallace?" Gabe asked, his voice tense. "No sign of him or the other one yet," the marshal replied. "But we've got men watching all the trails. They won't get far." Gabe's expression remained hard. "Don't underestimate Wallace, he's slippery." "We can escort you to the Green place," Wilson offered, looking at Harriet. "Safer that way." Harriet glanced at Gabe, unsure how he would react to the offer. Their journey together was coming to an end sooner than she had expected, and she found herself strangely reluctant to part from him. Gabe hesitated only briefly before nodding. "That would be best," he said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with the arrangement. They continued on with the marshal and his deputies riding alongside. The conversation turned to the details of Harriet's abduction and rescue, with Gabe providing most of the information in his concise way. downplaying his own role. By mid-morning, they crested a ridge and saw the Green homestead in the valley below a modest cabin with outbuildings, a small garden, and a corral for livestock. Smoke rose from the chimney, a welcome sight that meant someone was there tending to her father. As they approached, Mrs. Peterson, their nearest neighbor, emerged from the cabin. Her face lit up with relief at the sight of Harriet. "Thank the Lord," she called, rushing to meet them. "We've been worried sick about you, girl." Harriet dismounted quickly, embracing the older woman. "How is my father?" she asked urgently. "Holding his own," Mrs. Peterson assured her. "That cough's got worse, but he's fighting." Harriet didn't wait to hear more, hurrying into the cabin with her father's medicine clutched tightly in her hand. Behind her, she vaguely registered Gabe explaining the situation to Mrs. Peterson and the marshal, but her focus was entirely on reaching her father. Doc Green lay in his bed, his face pale and drawn with fever. Despite his illness, his eyes brightened at the sight of his daughter. "Harriet," he whispered, his voice raspy, "I knew you'd come back." "Of course I did," she said, blinking back tears as she knelt beside him. "And I brought your medicine." She quickly mixed the preparations from Dr. Reynolds according to the instructions, helping her father drink the bitter liquid. As she worked, she told him a simplified version of what had happened, emphasizing Gabe's role in her rescue. "This Gabriel Blackett," her father said when she had finished, his medical training overcoming even his illness. "He was injured, you say?" "Knife wound to the side," Harriet confirmed. "I stitched it." A faint smile touched her father's lips, "and my daughter thinks highly of him, I can tell." Harriet felt her cheeks warm. "He saved my life, father." Doc Green murmured, his eyes knowing despite the fever. "Invite him in. I should thank the man properly." Harriet stepped outside to find Gabe in conversation with Marshal Wilson, their expressions serious. He looked up as she appeared, a question in his eyes. "My father would like to meet you," she said, "if you don't mind." Gabe nodded, excusing himself from the marshal and following Harriet into the cabin. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. Doc Green studied him from the bed, his physician's gaze missing nothing the way Gabe held himself slightly stiff on his injured side. The weathered look of a man who lived in the open, the watchful eyes that took in every detail of the room. "Mr. Blackett," the older man greeted him. "It seems I owe you my daughter's life." "No debt owed, sir," Gabe replied respectfully. "Any man would have done the same." "No," Doc Green said firmly. "Not any man would have ridden alone after the Blackwater Gang. You have my eternal gratitude." Gabe accepted this with a slight nod, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "How are you feeling?" he asked, changing the subject. "The medicine should help with the fever." "Already working, I think," the doctor replied. "You have medical knowledge, some," Gabe admitted. "Picked up what I could in the cavalry and from tribal healers." Doc Green's interest visibly piqued. "Tribal medicine can be remarkably effective. I've incorporated several native treatments into my own practice." As the two men talked medicine, Harriet watched them with a growing warmth in her chest. Two very different men, her educated, gentle father, and the rugged frontiersman, who had saved her, finding common ground in their shared knowledge of healing. Eventually, Doc Green's energy began to flag, his eyelids drooping despite his interest in the conversation. "You need rest, father," Harriet said, adjusting his blankets. "The medicine will work better if you sleep." He nodded tiredly, but caught Gabe's hand before they could leave. "Young man," he said earnestly, "whatever your plans, know that you have a place here if you need it." Something flickered in Gabe's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a deeper emotion Harriet couldn't name. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "That means more than you know." Outside, the marshal and his deputies were preparing to leave. having accepted Mrs. Peterson's offer of coffee and sandwiches for their journey back to Bozeman. "We'll keep looking for Wallace," Marshal Wilson assured Gabe. "If we get him, the reward is yours by rights." Gabe nodded, though Harriet could tell from his expression that he had little faith in the marshal's ability to capture the gang leader. As the lawman rode away, a strange awkwardness fell between Harriet and Gabe, standing in the yard of her father's homestead. Their journey together was over. She had been returned safely home, her father had his medicine, and Gabe had no reason to stay, yet neither seemed ready to say goodbye. "Your wound," Harriet said at last. "I should check it before you go." Gabe hesitated, then nodded. "If it's no trouble." Inside the cabin's main room, with her father sleeping in the adjoining bedroom, Harriet carefully removed Gabe's bandage. The stitches had held, and the wound showed no signs of infection. As she applied a fresh bandage, her fingers lingered on his skin, reluctant to break the connection. "You did a good job," Gabe said softly. "Heals clean." Harriet looked up, finding his face closer than she expected. "Where will you go now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After Wallace," he replied, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. "And after that, when it's finished?" Gabe was silent for a long moment, his green eyes searching her face as if looking for an answer there. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I haven't thought beyond that in a long time." Harriet found the courage to say what was in her heart. "You could stay, for a while at least. Father meant what he said. You're welcome here." "Harriet," Gabe began, his voice rough with emotion, "what I do, who I am, it's not the kind of life that allows for what?" she challenged gently. "For friendship, for a place to call home. For something more." The last words hung between them, charged with meaning. Gabe's hand came up to touch her face, his calloused fingers unexpectedly tender against her cheek. "I've been alone a long time," he said quietly. "It's simpler that way, safer." "Safer isn't always better," Harriet replied, holding his gaze steadily. "Sometimes the greatest risk brings the greatest reward." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a surrender to a possibility he had denied himself for too long. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Gabe leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, but Harriet responded with a certainty that surprised even herself. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they parted, Gabe rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if overwhelmed by the moment. "I still have to go after Wallace," he said softly. "I can't leave that unfinished." "I know," Harriet acknowledged, "but will you come back when it's done?" Gabe opened his eyes, looking at her with an intensity that took her breath away. "If you'll have me," he promised. "I will," she whispered, sealing the promise with another kiss. 3 weeks later, Harriet was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her father, now recovered enough to sit in a chair by the window, looked out with interest. "Rider coming," he announced. "Single man on a black horse." Harriet's hand stilled, her heart suddenly racing. She had received no word from Gabe since he'd ridden away that day, promising to return when his business with Scar Wallace was concluded. Each day, she had watched the trail, hoping for his return, trying not to imagine the worst. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door, stepping out onto the porch just as Gabriel Blackett rode into the yard. He looked tired, and there was a fresh cut on his cheekbone, but he was alive and whole. Their eyes met across the yard, and a smile spread across Gabe's face, a real smile that transformed his features from handsome to breathtaking. "Is it done?" Harriet asked as he dismounted. Gabe nodded, climbing the porch steps to stand before her. "Wallace won't hurt anyone else ever again." Harriet searched his face, finding not the bitter satisfaction of vengeance but the quiet peace of justice completed. "And your sister can rest easy now," he said softly. "As can I." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving, a bird in flight, similar to the hawk she had admired in his cabin but more delicate. "I made this for you," he said, placing it in her hand. "A sparrow, small but brave like someone I know." Harriet's fingers closed around the carving, tears pricking at her eyes. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised I would," Gabe replied, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "If you'll still have me." In answer, Harriet stepped into his arms, her heart full to bursting as he held her close. Behind them, Doc Green watched from the window, a smile of approval on his face. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, Gabe told Harriet of his journey tracking Wallace to a remote hideout in the mountains, the final confrontation, the moment of reckoning. "I could have killed him," Gabe admitted, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Had him dead to rights. But I remembered something you said about healing being better than hurting, so I brought him in alive." Pride and love swelled in Harriet's heart. "What will happen to him?" "Territorial judge sentenced him to hang," Gabe replied. "But that's justice, not revenge. There's a difference." "And the reward?" Harriet asked. Marshal Wilson said it was substantial. A slow smile spread across Gabe's face. "Enough to buy a small ranch if a man were looking to settle down. Or to expand a medical practice if that's what was needed." Harriet turned to look at him fully, hope blooming in her chest. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Gabe took her hands in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I'm saying that for 3 years, all I thought about was hunting down the Blackwater Gang. I had no future beyond that. Then you came into my life, and suddenly I could see something more. Something worth living for, not just a purpose worth dying for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. "I'm saying I love you, Harriet Green, and if you'll have me, I'd like to build that future with you." Tears spilled down Harriet's cheeks as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her. Gabe slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. Inside the cabin, Doc Green raised a glass in silent toast to the couple silhouetted against the sunset. His daughter had found not just a good man, but a partner who understood the healing work that was her passion. And Gabriel Blackett, the lone wolf bounty hunter, had found something he'd thought forever lost: a home, a family, and love that would last a lifetime. Within a year, Gabriel Blackett had joined his father-in-law's practice, bringing his knowledge of tribal medicine and battlefield surgery to complement Doc Green's more traditional training. The small medical office in Bozeman became known throughout the territory for treating all who came through its doors, regardless of background or ability to pay. Harriet Blackett continued her work alongside her husband and father, eventually earning her own reputation as a skilled midwife and healer. Their home on the edge of town, built with the Blackwater Gang reward money, became a haven not just for their growing family, including twin boys born in the spring of 1880, but for those in need of shelter and care. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Harriet would often find Gabe on the porch, carving wood as he watched the Montana sunset. The shadows that had once haunted his eyes were gone, replaced by the contentment of a man who had found his true purpose not in vengeance or justice, but in love and healing, and the family that had given his life meaning beyond the trail.